appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we can get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Josh Bernstein on behalf of United Campus Workers of Mississippi and the American Association of University Professors to welcome everyone to our presentation this evening with Professor Brian Leiter. I myself am an associate professor of English at the University of Southern Mississippi. My co-host is Joe Atkins, who's here. He's a professor of journalism at the University of Mississippi, specializing in labor history in the South. One context for our discussion tonight is, as you may know, is that the trustees of public universities in Mississippi, it's called the IHL as their board, they met last March in secret to discuss changes to tenure and to leadership selection. The trustees then approved these changes without any discussion in April. The first set of changes to tenure allow a university leader, president or provost, to fire faculty for behavior deemed, quote, contumacious, insubordinate, or non-collegial. They can also fire faculty for, quote, ineffective communication. The second set of changes to leadership selection, and this will probably be less of a focus tonight for Professor Leiter, but it's important nonetheless. These changes would allow the IHL to appoint a university leader without consulting the stakeholders of the university, including students, faculty, or leaders of that university. And they could even make the search committee for those leaders anonymous now. There's been some revision to that, but not much. Finally, another context for our discussion tonight, as you may know, is that there is serious discussion in Mississippi and in other states of ending or limiting tenure. Our groups, United Campus Workers and American Association of University Professors, have come together to fight these changes, to help protect academic freedom and to ensure that each of us can have a say in our working conditions. UCW, our union, represents workers at Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Southern Miss, and Mississippi University for Women soon, I hope, and hopefully soon at Jackson State University. We've invited Professor Leiter to speak with us about the importance of tenure and academic freedom. He'll talk for about 30 minutes tonight, and then we'll have a Q&A for questions for about 30 minutes. I'd also like to encourage everybody to sign our open letter to the IHL opposing these recent changes and to help share it with others, including on social media. The truth is, I think we're really the only ones fighting this. And so if we don't speak up here, I don't think anyone else is going to. Our goal is to present this letter to the IHL when we have about 500 signatures, and right now we've crossed the 100 signature mark. If you're interested in joining the AUP or starting a chapter on your campus, perhaps you can be in touch with Jeremy Scott or Jen Kortz who are here. You can also be in touch about United Campus Workers with John Jester or Melanie Barron who are here, or others, or if you're on the USM campus, Andrew Haley or Teresa Bush. Our next statewide UCW meeting will be November 30th at 4 p.m. on Zoom. And everybody here is more than encouraged to come, members and non-members alike. And even if you're just interested in finding out more about us and what we do. Okay, Joe, can you introduce Professor Leiter?
Sure thing. Thank you, Josh. It's a great honor to be here and to introduce Brian Leiter. Brian Leiter is the Karl W. Llewellyn Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the Center for Law, Philosophy, and Human Values at the University of Chicago. He works on a variety of topics in moral, political, and legal philosophy in both Anglophone and continental European traditions. He's written extensively on Nietzsche and other philosophers and is an important observer of academic policies in this country. Dr. Leiter, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for being here. And my plan is to say something about what tenure is and what it's supposed to be and its connection to academic freedom, and then say a little bit about what academic freedom is. You're obviously facing a very serious situation, though it's not unlike the situation in a lot of other so-called red states, because as you know, Republican legislators through the ALEA, I think it's called, based in Michigan, they draft legislation and then share it among each other. And similar things have been going on in Florida, for example, but I know also in Texas. So let's start with tenure. What does tenure mean? Tenure means that an employee can only be terminated for cause or good cause, as it's sometimes put. And the contrast here is with the normal employment relationship in most contexts in the United States. which is what's called at-will employment. If you have at-will employment, it means you can be fired for any reason except membership in certain protected groups or classes, right? So you couldn't be fired from an at-will employment situation because of your race, your gender, your age, and so on. Okay? Now, the United States is a very backwards country, so that most employees are at-will employees. This is not true in Europe. It's not true in Australia. It's not true in many places. But at-will employment is the norm. One of the exceptions to that are university faculty, though we are not the only exception to that, and that's worth emphasizing. Public school teachers in most jurisdictions still enjoy tenure. Civil service employees at the federal level and at many state levels enjoy something like tenure, meaning again that employees can only be fired for cause. Okay? Now that then raises the question, what constitutes cause? Okay? And cause has to do with failure to perform the job. Right? One thing it cannot include for university faculty, the AAUP has been very clear about this, is it cannot include being contumacious and uncollegial. This is going to raise, I mean, if the Mississippi system follows through with this, is going to raise some difficult legal questions. I don't know whether there have been cases on point with respect to the standard of uncollegiality or contumaciousness. So that's something that may ultimately have to be litigated. But the AAUP position on this is very clear, which is that is not an appropriate standard for the termination of faculty. What else does for cause mean? It comes with a presumption of a certain amount of due process. Due process meaning a chance to be heard, to respond to allegations of failures to perform the job. Right? And in the university context, it's usually taken to mean that faculty have a right to be evaluated by their peers. Right? So any kind of process in which administrators, as it were, on their own, get to make these determinations is inherently suspect. The AAUP would certainly be opposed to it. And then, as I say, the big question will be what legal remedies would be available. Tenure, my assumption is that all of you have a contract with the employment contract with the university that includes tenure. That means changes to tenure can't be retroactive. That's called breach of contract. It's pretty straightforward, right? Nothing prevents the university from not obviously giving tenure to newly hired faculty. Right? It may also be breach of contract to change the standard by which a revocation of tenure is determined. Right? So again, if the universities try to take the position that being uncollegial and contumacious, I love that word, contumacious, uncollegiality and contumaciousness were grounds for firing tenured faculty, that arguably is also going to be a breach of contract. Okay? All right. So why do we even have tenure? What is the justification for tenure? The AAUP historically gave as one of the central justifications, though it tends to drop out of the conversation, that tenure is a form of non-monetary compensation for highly educated employees. Now, this is something that Republicans might actually understand in the sense that if you get rid of tenure, you're getting rid of the non-monetary compensation. People are going to want monetary compensation, right? It is a market after all. Now, the difficulty, I wouldn't run straight to that argument, is because universities, including my own, have been overproducing PhDs for so long that there is a large reserve army, as Marx would say, of people looking for academic jobs. So the pressure on the compensation issue is not as strong. But I think it is worth emphasizing that tenure is a form of non-monetary compensation. Right? that someone who is able to earn a PhD and invests the time and earns a PhD in a scholarly discipline and is employed at a university could have just gone to the University of Chicago Law School and started $200,000 a year after they graduate, right? I mean, that was part of the original rationale, is that you may not get as much money, but you get a certain kind of employment stability that comes from the idea that you can only be terminated for cause. Okay. That's one of the crucial justifications. The other one is, of course, the protection of academic freedom. And that just pushes the question back a level, which is, why should we want to protect academic freedom? Okay, and that's what I'm going to talk about in a moment. But those have been the two standard rationales, right? Non-monetary compensation for highly educated employees and professionals, and to protect academic freedom, on the theory that academic freedom is actually a good for society as a whole, which I'll come back to in a moment. Okay, so why should we protect academic freedom? Let's start by saying what exactly academic freedom means. Its definition in the United States, again, derives from the Association of American University Professors 1940 statement on academic freedom, and it has three components. Just an aside here, but it's an important aside, and the union may want to figure this out. At many universities, the AAUP definition of academic freedom is incorporated by reference as part of the employment contract. All right. Often the commitment to the AAUP definition of academic freedom will appear in the faculty handbook. There are jurisdictions, and the reason I know this is because Texas, where I used to teach, is one of them, where the courts have held that the faculty handbook is not incorporated as a part of the employment contract. Okay? Now, so you might want to find out whether you've got a contractual claim to the AAUP's definition of academic freedom. Even if you don't, in the public university system, you enjoy constitutional protection. How robust that is has not been, at least not yet, fully tested. But the Supreme Court has said many years ago that academic freedom is a particular constitutional value under the First Amendment. Right? And the courts are generally pretty good about taking the AAUP definition of academic freedom seriously. So what is that definition? It has three components. It includes freedom in research, freedom in teaching, and finally, freedom to engage in extramural speech without being sanctioned by your university. Okay? Extramural speech refers to when professors speak as citizens about matters of general public interest. It need not be in any way related to your academic work. Let me start with the first two, which I think are the core of academic freedoms in all jurisdictions that protect academic freedom, that is freedom in teaching and freedom in research. Those freedoms are actually limited in ways that are important to recognize. Right? They are limited by the standards of the discipline in which you teach and research. Okay? Which is to say that when I'm teaching a class in evidence law, right, I do not have the freedom to tell the students false things, like there is no hearsay rule in the United States. Right? That would be grounds for discipline. It also means that I don't have grounds for going on a rant about Donald Trump in the middle of the evidence class. Right? It is not a general right of free speech for the teacher in the classroom. It is a right of the teacher to decide, in accordance with their disciplinary standards, what material is worth teaching and how it should be taught. Okay? And the same is true with freedom in research. Again, it is subject to the limitations of the discipline in which you work, right? Which means that any claim that someone, right, is not entitled to academic freedom has to be assessed by disciplinary peers. That's a crucial part of the process in the protection of academic freedom. If there is an allegation that someone's teaching or research, right, is not covered by academic freedom and is grounds for sanction, that has to be evaluated by peers in the relevant discipline. And universities generally understand that's what the procedure is that required. So, if you recall the Ward Churchill case at the University of Colorado about 16 or 17 years ago. So Churchill made some offensive remarks about 9/11 that were picked up by the right-wing media and drew a lot of unfavorable attention to him and to the university. But they then went after him, right? So they couldn't openly simply punish him for being offensive, right? Though they probably could have punished him for being contumacious, which is one of the problems with that standard. But they couldn't just punish him for saying offensive things about 9/11. His speech was clearly constitutionally protected speech. He was a professor at a public university. So they launched an investigation into his work, and they made various accusations of scholarly misconduct. That is, that he had failed to live up to the standards of the relevant discipline. And in fact, they appointed a committee that included other scholars of Native American studies, for example, and an expert in Native Indian law, federal Indian law, as we tend to call it in law schools, and so on. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about the Churchill case, the horrifying thing, frankly, is that a jury ultimately decided that the committee that evaluated his work for misconduct didn't recommend firing him. The chancellor immediately said firing. But a jury that finally got the case after he sued the university concluded that it was completely pretextual, that the alleged academic wrongdoing was not the reason he was fired. He was fired for his constitutionally protected speech. That seems like a victory for the First Amendment and for an aspect of academic freedom. And then the Colorado Supreme Court decided that the regents of the University of Colorado enjoy a quasi-judicial immunity. That is, you can't sue the court for making a decision you don't like. And the Colorado Supreme Court said, well, same thing for the Board of Regents, which is insane. I mean, it basically makes a mockery of the doctrine of judicial immunity. I mention this just because this shows that weird things happen, right? That are completely sort of out of line with the ordinary norms that you would expect to govern these decisions. Okay, so we have freedom in teaching and research that is subject to the standards of the discipline. Any alleged violation has to be evaluated by scholarly peers in the relevant discipline. The third component of the AUP definition is the right to engage in extramural speech without being sanctioned by your university. Now, faculty at public universities do not depend only on the AUP for this. You have a constitutional right to speak on matters of public interest as a citizen without being punished by the government. Right? For those of us at private universities, the main protection in that regard comes from the contractual right we have to academic freedom under the AUP definition. For faculty at public universities, it is different. Because there's a general constitutional principle that public employees, cannot be punished for their viewpoint and cannot be punished for their lawful speech under the First Amendment. There are some limits to this, and the testing of the limits may prove to be very important in the years ahead. We will see. There's what's called and what's still known as the Pickering test for speech by public employees. And according, excuse me, this is, I had a cold last week, not COVID. I still have some residual irritation in my throat. The Pickering test basically says there's a balancing test that can be applied to attempts to regulate or sanction speech by a public employee. On the one hand, we look at how important is the matter on which the employee is speaking. Right? So if you're attacking, Donald Trump, that's a matter of significant public interest, right? You are entitled as a citizen to speak about that. Same thing if you're attacking Joe Biden, or whoever, whatever public political figure. But that has to be balanced against the ability of the governmental entity to discharge its functions, to perform its functions adequately. So in the Pickering case itself, a teacher in a public school district had written a letter to the editor. This is before the internet, so the speech was always much more benign because it was filtered through editors and so on. Written a letter to the editor criticizing the Board of Education's decisions about certain policy matters in the district. Clearly a matter of important interest. The local district wanted to discipline the teacher, and the court ultimately said, look, this is of important interest, and the fact that he wrote a letter to the editor did not disrupt the functioning of the school district in any way whatsoever. So they can't touch him. Many of you will recall the more recent case of Stephen Salida, excuse me, who was fired by the University of Illinois after a series of, shall we say, inflammatory or strongly worded tweets about the Israeli assault on Gaza. And the university ultimately settled that. But initially, it was clear that they were going to try to float a Pickering theory. That is, they started to suggest that, well, those kinds of tweets suggest he wouldn't be able to perform his duties in the classroom. Now, that was idiotic. Right? They had hired him with tenure, and they had 15 years worth of teaching evaluations, and there was simply no basis for the inference, and no university in its right mind, right, decides to evaluate teaching by looking at tweets. You look at teaching, right? That's what you do. But they were floating that theory for a while. And put it in the dirty laundry, please. I assume that wasn't directed to me, so I will continue. But Pickering, because it's a balancing test, it can depend on how the court looks at it, right? And I would not be surprised if Mississippi goes forward with trying to sanction contumacious faculty, that they take the position that contumacious faculty interfere with the functioning of the university. It's almost certainly what they're going to try to claim. And then you're going to have to hope that there are courts that take the AUP's opinion seriously and take traditional practice seriously, and are going to push back against any such effort to treat that as a grounds for sanctioning faculty. Okay, there's more that could be said about the constitutional legal issues, and I may come back to them. Let me turn, though, to the question, why do we protect academic freedom? And I do think sometimes this needs to be explained to political actors, because the central rationale, and this goes all the way back to Humboldt, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who created the modern university, the research university in Germany in the early 19th century, and first introduced the idea of Wissenschaftsfreiheit, that there should be freedom in research in the various scholarly disciplines. And John Stuart Mill got the idea actually from Humboldt, as he acknowledges. But the idea is pretty simple, which is that producing knowledge of what's true is good for society as a whole. The whole society has an interest in the discovery of knowledge and the promulgation of it, the sharing of it, and so on. Right? That's the crucial thing. Right? That was the crucial rationale going back to the beginning. Now, I think when dealing with political actors, of course, it may be hard to persuade them of why it's important to be up to date on the historical context in which Shakespeare wrote. Right? But I think the thing as a political and strategic matter is to focus on the areas where they can see that this is clearly the case, right? So that we need to understand what human psychology is like. We need to understand what pharmaceuticals work and don't. We need to understand biological, physical, and chemical processes, and so on. And that is the central rationale for the core academic freedom values. Okay? Now, the funny thing about the situation in the United States is because academic freedom also includes the right to extramural speech, right? That is justified on general First Amendment grounds. And there are many considerations there that can be appealed to, including the discovery of truth, but also, democratic self-governance. All citizens should be free and in a free society, in a democratic society, to speak about matters of public interest, even if other people are offended by their speech. The odd situation we have is that faculty with tenure enjoy an unusually high protection in that regard compared to anyone in the private sector, for example. But again, this is a slight anomaly of the United States, but that's where it is. So that, I take it, is the standard justification, that by giving people freedom in research and teaching, we raise the likelihood of discovering truths about the world, about the physical world, the social world, about our literary and artistic heritages, right? And that all of this has some value for everyone in society, ultimately, even if it's quite indirect. Right? That is the basic rationale for it. Let me conclude my initial remarks on just a practical point, which I think is important for people to be aware of, especially given what you're up against right now in Mississippi. There are two organizations that now have money to fund lawyers to protect the academic freedom rights of faculty. One is the Academic Freedom Alliance, the AFA, of which I was one of the founding members, but not an organizer. They have money largely from private sources, and they have been funding lawyers for faculty whose academic freedom rights are under attack. The other is FIRE. I forget what it's an acronym for. Freedom and Individual Rights in Education. That's what it is. Okay. In the beginning, if you go back 30 years, FIRE started with a disproportionate interest in protecting speakers on the right. But I don't think that's the issue anymore, and I've dealt with them a lot at this point. They were actually on the correct side of the Ward Churchill case, and Ward Churchill was certainly not a figure on the right. FIRE also has lawyers on staff and funding and resources to provide legal counsel to faculty whose academic freedom rights are under attack. Okay? And they have stepped in a lot of recent cases around the country. And in some cases, the lawyers have filed lawsuits. In others, the legal intervention was actually helpful in resolving the matter peacefully, shall we say. That is, without having to go to court. So important to bear those resources in mind. Now, the union itself may also have its own resources in this regard, but the AFA and FIRE are two, I think, very important resources, and more people are going to need them in the years ahead, because these efforts to undermine tenure, to interfere and attack academic freedom are growing. Florida, under Ron DeSanctimonious, as Mr. Trump aptly named him, has been at the forefront of this, but what starts in Florida is going to spread unless the courts whack it down there. And they may, because he's really been pushing the envelope on existing constitutional and First Amendment doctrines in terms of his attempted interference in the public universities and public education. Okay, that's a good place to stop, but I'm happy to take questions on anything and say more about the philosophical arguments as well as the legal issues. So.
I think
oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so you touched on a lot of things that we're dealing with here, and I'll introduce myself. So I'm Dr. Jeremy Scott. I'm the president of the U.S. Southern Miss chapter of AEQ. And I'm actually in a spot, I know this was about tenure, but we have a lot of these, we have teaching track. And so I'm in that spot. And as the president last year, I actually wrote an op-ed, but from the chapter, not from myself, that we all worked on, right? I didn't just do it independently. And, and we put it in the Clarion Ledger, which is the newspaper in the capital of our state, right? So that I wanted them to see it. And so, at that time, I'm like, well, I'm even less protected, not even being tenured. But the other thing that I wanted to just my question though,
Can I just say something about the very first observation you made? Because this is important, because I know a lot of faculty are on teaching tracks.
yeah,
As a faculty member at a public university, you still have the exact same First Amendment right as any tenured faculty member to speak about matters of public interest, right? And in that sense, you are fully protected by the Constitution. Now, the problem is, right, that it's probably easier for them to dismiss
right.
teaching track faculty. If that happens, you want to contact FIRE and the AFA because you have a legal case, right? You have a First Amendment right. It's got nothing to do now specifically with the AUP. You just have a First Amendment right to express your views about how the legislature is treating the university or what policies they're adopting. It's just like the Pickering case, right? It's just like the old Pickering case in that regard. So, but go ahead with your
No, that's
question.
great. Thank you. I'm glad you stopped me and you explained that bit. It gave me that piece of information. The other bit that Josh had alluded to at the beginning about our presidential search. Actually, it was actually worse than he stated. It turns out there wasn't even a job posting. And I'm wondering if that, like, does that somehow, there's an Equal Opportunity Employment Act, does that somehow violate that?
Okay, so the answer is probably, okay. The problem is you would have to find the plaintiff, that is someone with standing, someone who was harmed by their failure to post it. And that's going to be very difficult, which is, I'm sure, why they thought they could get away with it, right? But yes, any job at a public university, indeed any job at a private employer, right, has to comply with the Equal Opportunity Employment laws, right? And one of those is, as it were, publicity about the position, right? So that it's open to everyone who might be qualified. You know, so again, that's not a specifically academic freedom issue, but it does sound like a violation of the Equal Opportunity laws, and nothing's going to happen because there isn't anyone out there who's currently a provost or a dean who's going to say, I would have applied if I'd known about this, and now I'm going to sue the University of Mississippi system. And the reason they're not going to do that is because if they've already become a high-level administrator, they're probably thinking about getting other administrative jobs, right? And so they're not going to want to be the plaintiff.
So my question about that is, again, going back to an op-ed, if we want to take action as AUP, should we say that this is, because there are other universities in our state where this is happening. I've spoken to other, and should we just say that, isn't this a violation of standards of how we normally employ people at the state level?
Right. I think it's perfectly fair to raise that in public, that this seems to be in violation of equal opportunity laws.
Yeah.
I don't know whether what the position of the AUP is on this particular issue. They may have a position, and I may just be ignorant of it. If you do another one of these, Josh and Joseph, you should invite my former Texas colleague, David Raban, R-A-B-B-A-N, who was general counsel of the AUP for a long time, has a much deeper knowledge of the law of academic freedom and tenure. And he would know the answer to a question like the one that was just raised about whether the AUP has a position on how administrative positions are filled. Is someone going to take responsibility for calling on people?
Yeah, thank you. And I wanted to thank you for doing this, for giving this lecture.
You're welcome.
The question
My pleasure to share information.
I can call on.
Okay.
Don, would you?
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Excuse me, it's the afternoon, evening. I'm the faculty senate president at Jackson State University. And one issue of concern that often comes to me from my colleagues is that they're constantly they send emails to administrators, to chairs, to deans. They don't get a response. They kind of reach out and go to other colleagues in the college and the department. So what happens when a faculty member is told by a provost, for example, say, hey, don't you email me anymore. I'm going to take to handle this professionally and formally because you are harboring on lines of violating collegiality. So,
okay.
what does that look like in terms of faculty when they talked about contentious behavior? So a faculty member sees that as a threat and has said that,
Yep.
say it so publicly because the emails they sent out were talking about in their particular department and unit about the standard of teaching and how they think that we're trying to just pass students because of low, so the faculty member spoke out to all his colleagues. So how is that addressed? Is the provost, person feels threatened. Now they're saying you violated professional collegiality. So any advice you can
Right.
give or
Well, this is a case where you may want to have a lawyer in the mix. Though my initial instinct is that I would respond to any claim about lack of collegiality by saying that I'm writing to you about a matter that is essential to the proper functioning of the university and my unit, right? And which we require guidance and on which, whatever the issue is, right? And the reason I suggest framing it that way, I have to preface this by saying that I am not admitted to practice law in Mississippi, so I cannot give you legal advice, but I can give you sensible advice, okay? And my sensible advice is to frame the communications with the provost in terms of contributing to the effective functioning of the department and the university and meeting the needs of the students, right? Because what they're going to want to have to come back and argue is somehow this was disruptive to the functioning of the department and the university. And that this goes back to Pickering, right? The point is, if a faculty member is challenging the provost about certain questions about teaching and grading, this goes to a core university function, and the faculty member is trying to make sure that the core university function is discharged appropriately and responsibly, right? And that's why they're communicating with the provost, right? But I agree with you, when a provost says things like that, it is vaguely threatening. But I would, as I say, I would suggest responding in those terms, right? That is, as a strategic matter, be polite, be restrained, but emphasize that this is important to, our job. We are trying to do our job at the university and in this department properly and in a way that meets the needs of our students and does so fairly and appropriately, right? And that is why we are communicating with you. And that might, depends on your provost, of course. But if the provost were really to move towards sanctioning someone about this, then you need a lawyer.
All right, thank you.
Professor.
And I might reach out to you because we have a faculty series series, and we look for speakers to come in. So you and your colleague probably get an email from me sometime in 2023. Talk to our faculty senate if you're interested. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Leiter, let me ask you a question. When the Institutions of Higher Learning Board met to make these changes, met in secret, it was reported that during that conversation that the point was made that even a tenured professor can be fired for just cause or good cause. And you discussed this earlier in your comments. And
That's
then
correct, yeah.
one of the members of the board who comes from the private sector, who's a business owner, what have you, said, well, I don't even need a just cause. I don't need a cause. You just fire somebody.
That's right.
Could there be a slippery slope here if more attacks on tenure are made that they eventually don't even need a just cause?
Okay, so employers in the private sector are used to at-will employment. They're used to being able to do what they want as long as they don't engage in unlawful race, gender, age discrimination, right? And that's why they have a lot of trouble understanding why do these people have tenure. And they need to understand, this is why the terms are important. Tenure means you are not an at-will employee. It is different than the private sector. Then they say, well, why should it be different? And then you say, well, here's two reasons it should be different, right? It's a form of non-monetary compensation that brings highly educated people into this line of work, right? And it supports academic freedom, which is because it's in the interest of society as a whole, to have free inquiry and research to discover the truths about the world, whether it's biology or whether it's physics or history or whatever. We need that kind of opportunity and free debate. In that regard, it's consistent with the First Amendment. Now, it is very clear that members of boards of trustees from the private sector don't understand this. They don't understand why they can't treat university employees as badly as they treat their regular employees. Okay. And they need to understand that tenure is a feature of the employment contract, right? And they can't breach the employment contract unless the university wants to get sued, which it will. Right? It'd be a class action, in fact, if they tried to revoke tenure of all the tenured faculty. So a lot of education needs to be done, right? Because again, I think these people who come out of the private sector tend not to get it. I don't want to say generally, right? For a long time, I think the board of trustees in the university tech system was actually pretty good until Rick Perry started to stack it with, some more political appointees. So there's variation, but there's an opportunity. There's a need for some education, right? Which is, look, you have a contract. The university, the state of Mississippi has a contract with thousands of faculty. That means they cannot be terminated at will, period. And we can't have a massive breach of contract, right? And then they'll say, well, what about the faculty we hire in the future? Well, they could eliminate tenure for those faculty. And then the point is you won't be able to hire any faculty. Now, between us, maybe that's not true, but that's what they need to understand. It's going to be totally different, right? They're either going to have to pay more money, and I do think that's the thing they need to hear. They're going to have to pay more money to hire faculty without tenure, right? Do they want to do that? Otherwise, faculty won't come to the Mississippi campuses, They'll go to Louisiana, they'll go to Oklahoma, right? They'll go, to Oregon, right? Places where they still have the opportunity for tenure. So that's the educational component of what needs to be done. And it's difficult. It's difficult because, again, the private sector mindset is everyone is an at-will employee. And that means we can get rid of them when they're contumacious or uncollegial or whatever. We're just annoyed with them on a particular day, right? That's Elon Musk and Twitter, right? That's what he did. He got rid of all the at-will employees. A few of them he had to pay handsomely for getting rid of them because they had that in their contracts. But most of them just fired, no consequence whatsoever.
Thank you. Thank you.
Josh Doman has a question. Josh, if you want to ask that, you're welcome to, or I can speak on your behalf. Josh said, I've always been told that tenure is about shared governance. Josh, do you want to continue?
Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. Yeah, so I'm wondering if there is any precedent for thinking about tenure in terms of the value of shared governance. So you can't sit on a faculty senate if you're an untenured faculty member. And part of the goal of tenure is you sort of prove your merit, you prove you're a good contributor to your university community, so then you can sit on faculty senate and share in the governance of the institution. Is there anything in AAUP guidance about that sort of consideration?
Okay, so this is again gets into something where I don't recall what the AAUP position is. That is certainly an argument I've heard before. It's certainly a sensible argument. Again, if we're talking about the board of trustees, the talk about shared governance is going to strike them as outer space, right? We don't have shared governance in the private sector. Why do we have it here? And so I think the real point that needs to be pressed with them, right, is that, universities to function need people who make long-term investments and have knowledge of institutional history and, right? And in a way, tenure makes that possible. Right. And even in the private sector, where at-will employment is the norm, there's still a lot of, as it were, cognizance of that fact that you can't just dump people, willy-nilly, or you can't function. This is actually what Elon Musk is finding out with Twitter. You might use this as an example, right? I mean, he fired way too many people, and then he started trying to hire them back after 24 hours, right? Because there too, even though they don't speak of shared governance, right? You need people with an investment in an institution who know how things work, right? Who know how things work at the ground level. And when you tenure faculty, you get people, right, who have a long-term investment in making the place work and know a heck of a lot of things that you can't write down and that you need in order for an institution to carry on. Right? So I think that's probably the way to frame it, but you know, I do think I think it is a tenure value. I don't think it's as important, and my own judgment will be is it's not as important as non-monetary compensation and academic freedom, but it's not unimportant. It's a relevant consideration.
Thank you.
Professor Leiter, I have a question for you. Do you think there's any role for organizing or for unions in these discussions about academic freedom or tenure, or do you think that's a traditionally different category?
No, I think absolutely a union representing faculty, you know, is representing all their contractual and professional interests, and that includes their interest in academic freedom. Now, I don't know, you know, in the not so great state of Texas where I used to live, right? Unions could not negotiate on behalf of the faculty. There were unions, but they were basically toothless in terms of doing anything. Is that the case in Mississippi too? Can they actually negotiate collectively? There's no collective bargaining. Okay. So within the constraint of not being able to collectively bargain, the unions should certainly be speaking out on these issues, right? Because unions exist, you know, to protect the professional interests of their members. And that includes, of course, salary and benefits and so on. But for faculty, it includes tenure and academic freedom, right? You know, my father used to work for the teachers union in New York City, right? And, you know, tenure was a huge fight there, right? And a lot of what my father did was, you know, going head to head with principals who were like the people of the Board of Trustees. They were used to running their schools as private fiefdoms, where everyone had to be collegial and uncontumacious and kiss their ass, right? And the union, the United Federation of Teachers, completely changed that in New York City. And then many of the principals hated it. And you know, my father's nickname was the Slasher because he used to cut them to pieces, you know, once the legal rights were in place for this. So absolutely, unions representing faculty should be out front on these issues.
James.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
I can.
great. Thank you very much for your talk. I missed some of it. I was driving and I didn't necessarily have my full attention on some of what you said, but there was one thing that struck me, and I'm curious to hear more about it. And that was about the way that, if I understood correctly, you were saying that it would be a breach of contract for the university to change the tenure and promotion criteria after we've already been hired. Is that what you were saying? It was fairly early on in your talk, I think.
Yeah, it would certainly be a breach of contract for faculty who are already tenured. It's probably also a breach of contract for tenure track faculty who were hired with the representation that they were on a track to tenure that meant only termination for good cause. So I think they would both have breach of contract.
Okay.
claims.
So then the question is, and I don't know how much you know or you would like to know about what's going on here, but just briefly, the Board of Trustees does want to change our faculty handbook, and they want to change the criteria for tenure and promotion. And I'm on our faculty senate at Mississippi State University, and at the moment we were presented with some draft language that would change that from University Council, which everyone on faculty senate disapproved of. We weren't actually asked to vote on it at that time. We were asked to send it to subcommittees to review. But in the meantime, now the administrators at our university have gone back to the drawing board, apparently, with the attempt to come up with some new language that is supposed to be honoring the intent of the Board of Trustees while also maintaining our traditional criteria for tenure and promotion. So,
Right.
I don't know how they can possibly square that circle when they're trying to, when the IHL wants, it seems to me, to just make it easier to fire people.
Right.
But B, what kind of threshold is there for changing criteria to amount to breach of contract?
Okay, so one thing the Board of Trustees can clearly do is say that for anyone hired subsequently, here's the new criteria for tenure and promotion. What I don't think they can do without inviting a lawsuit over breach of contract is change those criteria retroactively and say to people currently on tenure track, here's the new criteria for tenure and promotion. So, one battle to fight is to get them to understand that this is, a massive lawsuit waiting to happen if they try to change the criteria for existing tenure track faculty. The more important battle for the long-term viability of the system, right, is to get them to understand the costs of changing it going forward, right? And that's where I think it's really important that they understand that tenure has traditionally been a form of non-monetary compensation for highly educated professionals, right? And that if it's taken off the table, right, it's either the university is going to have to start paying people a lot more. That's what they got to understand. That's the kind of thing that does catch their attention, right? It'll be more you have to pay much higher salaries, right? Or you won't be able to hire people. And the whole thing is, the whole system is going to be in crisis, right? And so in a way, tenure is a cheap form of compensation that doesn't really cost the university anything. Now, some of these people are obviously thinking, well, but what about those radical leftist professors we want to fire, right? That's part, I'm sure, what's going on in the background here. And, and there they just need to understand that's unconstitutional, right? That this is a public university system, the First Amendment controls, okay? They cannot fire people, right? I mean, it's a general rule that public employers, right, cannot decline to hire people, and they can't punish them because of their political point of view. There's a few exceptions, right? Biden can appoint only Democrats to the cabinet, right? Trump can appoint only Republicans to the cabinet. That's allowed. But otherwise, it's just verboten under American constitutional law for a public employer to say, oh, you hold the following, view about a political question. We won't hire you or we'll fire you. That's illegal. And I think many of these people don't actually understand that. But look, I don't want to, the University of Illinois system, their firing of Stephen Salaita was totally illegal from the get-go. And they finally settled the case when the federal district court made very clear that they thought he had a breach of contract claim, that he was a contractually tenured employee of the university. But and the board of regents of the University of Illinois is made up of a bunch of Democrats, and they still behave completely disgracefully. Completely disgracefully. As I wrote to some of them, Chris Kennedy, he's part of the Kennedy family, right? He acted in complete contempt of very clear law. That's the problem in the real world. And the federal district judge at least, set them partly right. But at the end of the day, Stephen Salaita drives a bus. And he got about $600,000, even though he got 30 years of his career stolen from him. That's not so good. Sorry, that's a downer, but that's the reality of the legal system.
Andrew Haley.
Thank you, and I apologize for not being on camera. It's not convenient at the moment. I have another question, but I wanted to follow up on something you've said a couple of times, and that is about the idea of breach of contract. So
yeah.
At the University of Southern Mississippi, and I assume across Mississippi, we sign annual contracts, right? We have even though I am tenured and have been tenured for about 8 years now, I sign an annual contract. Does that contract reset the conditions of my tenure, or does the tenuring 8 years ago establish the standards?
Okay, so my expectation, but now speaking as a non-Mississippi lawyer, is that the tenure is continuous and that the only thing that's being reset is your compensation. But a lawyer would need to look at the terms of that letter, okay? But, you know, I sign such a letter, or rather I get such a letter every year at the University of Chicago that has information about salary. It actually doesn't say anything about tenure or academic freedom, though if I remember, maybe I should, I'm not worried about this at the University of Chicago. I did become a little worried about it at the University of Texas, the way things were going. This is something, I think, a very useful thing the union could do, maybe with access to a lawyer, is figure out the status of these annual employment letters under Mississippi law. Because Mississippi law, state law usually governs contracts. There's a lot of similarity between states in terms of contract law, but it would be good to get the opinion of a Mississippi lawyer. But the whole point of being granted tenure on a particular date in the past is that you have the right only to be terminated for cause, right? And that continues year in and year out, right? Otherwise, that would be a retroactive changing of the, of the contractual agreement you entered into when you got tenure, right? As it were, you accepted tenure. You didn't say, fuck tenure, I want to go somewhere else, right? So you have a reliance interest, as they say, in that commitment.
So that was kind of my follow-up question, but I had a different question, and that is that recently there have been a lot of cases of faculty who were terminated because of student complaints about the effectiveness of their teaching, right? So how much freedom do faculty actually have in terms of determining the standards for grading, for assignments? At what point does the university have an interest in those things and grounds for dismissal?
Okay, so termination for cause can include failure to do a competent job teaching. The question now is what counts as proof of failure to do a competent job teaching. Now, I think the position that the AUP takes and that the union should take is that student evaluations are one data point, but again, there needs to be evaluation by peers in the discipline, right? So if there is a concern about teaching, other members of the faculty in that field need to be visiting classes and writing reports about the teaching. Student evaluations are simply one data point. There's now a large literature about, empirical literature about the problems with teaching evaluations, right? I mean, the better looking you are, the better your teaching evaluations are. And I thought the students loved me, but it turns out it's just my good looks, right? There's all, and then there's gender bias. I mean, there's all kinds of weird biases in it. They are a data point, right? It does not seem to me consistent with academic freedom, certainly as the AUP has understood it, and with the traditional way it has been assessed, to think that you can fire someone because of bad teaching evaluations alone. It seems to me bad teaching evaluations can trigger further evaluation of teaching, but that has to involve peers in the discipline. Let me make a very general comment related to this. I do think that faculty and universities have sometimes been remiss in not terminating faculty for cause when it was justified, and that has created some problems, right? We all know, right? We all know the stereotype of the deadwood professor, right? But there really are faculty, right, who aren't doing research and are doing a lousy job on teaching, right? And universities, if they want tenure to be taken seriously, have to act when there actually is cause. But that means they have to follow a process. There has to be peer assessment and evaluation, right? It can't be done at the whim of the dean or the president or whatever. It's got to be within the discipline in which the faculty member works. There has to be an assessment about whether or not the job is actually being done. That's what for cause termination means.
Thank you.
We probably have time for two final questions. Tom and then Jeremy.
Yeah, Professor, thank you so much for your insights on this. And I liked your last comment. I had a conversation with the provost, the former provost, a few years ago, And his assumption was that we were at the AAUP, we were protecting rogue professors, you know, and that wasn't what we were up to. We were up to you know, shared governance issues. So thank you for that. But my point is, like, you know, you're talking to a group that understands kind of the necessity of conflict, let's say, what's legal, what's not. And then we have this history where, you know, in spite of what's legal, we purge faculty who didn't sign oaths or who were gay or who were members of a particular organization. And, you know, I've told my students and fellow faculty members that you only have rights when you stand up for them. And I'm wondering, I know this is a little more philosophical, obviously, but I was wondering if you could comment on that and what could enhance, if I'm on the right track, what could enhance that?
Well, you know, I mean, it's a fair question, but probably not for me. I'm not an expert in political organizing. You know, of course, there's a long history of violation of faculty's contractual and constitutional rights. I mentioned Steve Saleta, I mentioned Ward Churchill, right? And, you know, when you have to end up in court, that's already a bad development. So that part of this is why I mentioned the AFA and FIRE, is that sometimes getting lawyers into the mix early can actually diffuse things, lead administrators to calculate costs and decide to behave better. I do worry, as your question suggests, that we are into a period when, you know, we're going to see some of the worst excesses of earlier periods of time, right? You know, such as the 1950s when faculty were, you know, fired for their political affiliations. This is one reason, you know, this is related to this. I think the diversity statements that university requirement are increasingly requiring are also unconstitutional for the same reason that the loyalty oaths were unconstitutional. That you cannot require faculty to profess commitment to a particular political view. You can require faculty to abide by the laws that prohibit race, gender, and other kinds of discrimination. You can require faculty to teach competently and to meet the needs of all their students, but you can't require them to affirm belief in a particular view about a particular value. And so I do think those cases are actually the same, even though, of course, the opposition to the diversity oaths is coming from a very different place generally than the opposition to the McCarthy era loyalty oaths. But yes, no dispute that political organizing is important, and this is why unions are important, and unions have an important role to play in this, in terms of organizing and getting people behind objections to changes to the rules that violate academic freedom, that undermine the tenure to which the university is contractually committed with almost all of you, right? I mean, that's really important, right? And remember, those of you who don't have the tenure, you still have First Amendment rights, right? And the university can't opt out of those. The Board of Trustees can't say, we don't want to apply the First Amendment to faculty. Even the conservative Fifth Circuit won't go for that.
Not sure about that. Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you. This is just another question as being the AUP chapter president that I've seen. Are you familiar with Committee A kind of work stuff? Yeah, so we have, it turns out some of our faculty or departments or schools or whatever you want to call it, there's pockets of this culture that, and we're on a 9-month contract, right? So and people leave over the summer or do their thing or go do research or whatever, and now they want faculty to be participating in committee work and things like that over the summer, and off contract work, basically, which is, you know, involuntary servitude in my mind. But now it turns around, then they keep getting negative service evaluations on their annual evaluation. And it's leading, and I don't want to give too many details because I'll, you know, but to people getting into that post-tenure review process, kind of, it's a trap, you know, so
So
they're
you really
they're
need a
being
lawyer.
punished for trying to do slave labor. In my mind, they're not
You
being
need a
paid.
You need a Mississippi employment lawyer for this issue. Because you can't require faculty to do work that's not part during their contractual term, and then you can't punish them for not doing it, right? And look, and there's lots of employers that do this in America, right? That try to get unpaid labor out of people. This is just an instance of it. You need a Mississippi employment lawyer to get on the case about this, and you know, and send the university
How do we find
a
them?
letter.
How do we
What's
find
that?
them? Can you help me find these people?
Where are you in Mississippi?
Hattiesburg?
Here in Hattiesburg. I can ask some people.
Because it's a serious problem. It really is.
It's a very serious problem, right? Send me an email about that and let me, I can ask some law professors I know about employment lawyers, and
Sure.
Any Mississippi employment lawyer will do it. So I actually may just, but send me an email and I'll get back to you with a suggestion. But you do need a Mississippi employment lawyer to intervene.
Can you give me your
because
email
that's
address, please?
Illegal. What's that?
Could you please
You can
give me?
Google my name and find it.
Okay.
I mean, I'll provide it, or we'll be.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, right, Joshua Bernstein has it since we've corresponded.
And again, thank you for showing up and doing this, and really I appreciate it. And you've
You're
been
welcome.
great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to help, and I wish you folks good luck. I'm sure Josh will keep me apprised of the mischief by the Board of Trustees, and you know, and I do blog about this stuff, and the people at the AFA and Fire read my blog. So, you know, but again, you shouldn't hesitate to reach out to them if there's a, you know, concrete problem, because they've got lawyers, not employment lawyers though. The employment law question is different from the academic freedom tenure question. So I wish you all good luck.
On behalf of everyone, Professor Leiter, thank you for being here and for spending your time with us. This is immensely valuable to all of us.
Okay, good. I'm glad it was helpful. And again, nice to talk with some of you. And again, I do wish you good luck about this. And I'm sure Josh will keep me apprised of what develops. So have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.